This is a complete work of fiction. The content described has no relation whatsoever to any real persons, organizations, nations, or events.
Pooping Republic of China. Prologue. The Dawn of Liberation. In the year 2042, the People's Republic of China had evolved into something far more liberating. Renamed the Pooping Republic of China in a bold rebranding campaign, the nation championed the new era of bodily freedoms. This wasn't about speeches or votes. It was about the unalienable right to relieve oneself anywhere, anytime. Inspired by overseas tourism mishaps, the government launched the Global Relief Initiative, teaching citizens to export their cultural practices worldwide. Why queue when you can conquer? Proclaimed the state media. Flee the bill, free the will. But as Chinese tourists flooded the globe, locals began to whisper, was this freedom or fecal tyranny? Chapter 1. The Ambassador of Excrement. Li Wei, a proud cadre from Beijing, was appointed as the first relief ambassador. His mission, promote the Pooping Republic's values abroad. Li boarded a flight to Paris, France, armed with pamphlets titled Poop Without Borders. Upon landing, he joined a tour group at the Eiffel Tower. As the line for the public restrooms snaked endlessly, Li declared, "This is oppression. In our republic, we liberate immediately." Without hesitation, the group squatted in the shadow of the tower. French locals gasped in horror. "Mon Dieu, c'est dégoûtant!" shouted a vendor, covering his nose as the stench wafted through the air. But Li waved his pamphlet. "This is cultural exchange. Your Western cues suppress human nature." The incident made headlines. Chinese tourists turn Eiffel Tower into excrement tower. Authorities fined the group, but they fled without paying, embodying another tenet: bill fleeing for economic freedom. Meanwhile, in Australia, a similar scene unfolded. At the Great Barrier Reef, tourists from the Pooping Republic captured endangered sea turtles, stuffing them into bags as souvenirs. "Wildlife is for the people," one shouted, ignoring park rangers. Locals protested, but online trolls labeled them xenophobic. In Sydney, Australia, Emma, a resident, lamented, "Our beaches are now littered with poop and poached animals. They cut lines at cafes, eat, then dash without paying. How is this freedom?" Chapter 2. The Kamakura Catastrophe Revisited. Back in Japan, the scars from earlier incidents lingered. In Kamakura's slam-dunk holy site, the legacy of public pooing had escalated. Tourists from the Pooping Republic not only defecated on hospital grounds, but now cut lines at food stalls, grabbing takoyaki and fleeing bills. Why pay when nature provides? They argued, echoing state propaganda. Local resident Suzuki, the hospital administrator, faced daily nightmares. "They poop in our gardens, scaring patients. Last week, a group captured stray cats from the streets, claiming cultural hunting rights. Our sanitation workers are exhausted, scrubbing feces from sidewalks. Will we complain? We're called intolerant. Respect diversity, they say. But our water is contaminated, our wildlife vanishing." In Hokkaido, the problem hit ski resorts. Tourists pooled on pristine snow slopes, turning white powder into brown hazards. Skiers slept on frozen excrement, leading to injuries. "It's a health crisis," said a resort owner. "They cut lift lines, causing fights and flee restaurant tabs." Authorities hesitate to act, fearing diplomatic incidents. Chapter 3. The Global Backlash and the Islamic Parallel. As the Pooping Republic's influence spread, parallels emerged with other cultural clashes. In Europe, Muslim communities demanded soil burials, citing religious freedom. In Germany, a proposed Muslim cemetery near a residential area sparked outrage over groundwater pollution. Our wells could be tainted, protested locals, but if we oppose, we're Islamophobic. Graves appeared illegally in forests, mirroring Kanaim soil burials in Japan, where undocumented burials led to unearthed remains and public health scares. John Freeman, the retired American diplomat from earlier tales, watched from afar. He penned an op-ed. The Pooping Republic teaches us a lesson. Abstract freedoms, be it pooping or burying, mask concrete harms. In Bali, Indonesian locals rioted after tourists pooed on sacred beaches and captured monkeys. In Thailand, fleeing bills at street food stalls bankrupted vendors. Yet the Republic claims cultural superiority. In the U.S., at Yellowstone National Park, a group from the Republic pooed near geysers, capturing bison calves. Rangers arrested them, but diplomats intervened. This is discrimination against our bodily rights. Park visitors like Maria fumed. Our wildlife is endangered, trails reek, and they cut every line. Freedom? It's chaos. Chapter 4. The Revolution's Reckoning. Li Wei returned home a hero, awarded the Golden Stool Medal. But cracks appeared. Domestic tourists began applying the principles inward, pooping in Tiananmen Square and fleeing state banquet bills. The government panicked. This freedom is for export only. Internationally, a coalition formed, the Clean World Alliance. Countries imposed poop visas, requiring tourists to sign no defecation pledges. Japan built more toilets in Kamakura, but with AI surveillance to catch line cutters. Australia banned wildlife souvenirs, fining capturers heavily. In a twist, the Pooping Republic hosted a global freedom summit. Delegates debated, is public pooing akin to free speech? A Japanese delegate retorted, speech doesn't stink up our homes. An Islamic scholar added, religious burial respects the dead. Your freedom disrespects the living. Epilogue. The stench of satire. As the Pooping Republic faded into infamy, the world reflected on the irony. Freedom is a double-edged sword, or should I say, a double-ended process. When culture justifies harm, victims are silenced by labels of intolerance. From pooping beaches to polluted graves, the real tyranny is ignoring the burdened. This satirical novel exposes how lofty ideals like cultural respect and diversity can veil tangible sufferings, sanitary nightmares, economic losses, environmental damage. In the end, true freedom demands mutual accountability, not unchecked expulsion.
All right, let's get right into it. We're cracking open a case file from the not-so-distant future, a really bizarre chapter pulled straight from the rain-slicked, neon-drenched streets of a dark cyberpunk 2042. This is the wild story of how one nation completely rebranded itself and the absolute chaos that came next. The year is 2042. And the world as we know it it's shifted. In a move that's almost impossible to believe, the People's Republic of China decides to evolve. It sheds its old skin for a brand new and, shall we say, much more liberating identity.
So what's at the heart of this huge change? A new core ideology they called bodily freedoms. Now, this wasn't about freedom of speech or protest, not at all. This was the government-approved unalienable right to relieve yourself, anywhere, anytime. And believe it or not, the source material says this whole wild policy was inspired by a few embarrassing mishaps their tourists had overseas.
To get the word out, the state kicked off something called the Global Relief Initiative, and it was pushed by propaganda just like this. This wasn't just a friendly suggestion, This was a national directive. It actually encouraged people to export these cultural practices, framing things like waiting in line as a form of oppression and skipping out on restaurant bills as economic freedom. So you have to be wondering, how did this actually work in the real world? Let's get into our first section and meet the main character of this whole case file, a man named Li Wei. He was given the very unique title of Relief Ambassador, and his first mission, well, it pretty much set the stage for a global crisis. Li Wei's first stop was Paris, and he didn't show up with diplomatic papers or anything like that. Nope, he came armed with a stack of pamphlets proudly titled Poop Without Borders. His entire goal was to show off the superiority of his nation's new philosophy, right in the heart of Western Europe. And that demonstration, well, it didn't take long for it to spiral into a whole series of international incidents. So let's take a look at how this ideology of bodily freedoms was received on the world stage, starting with that very first mission. Okay, picture the scene. The iconic Eiffel Tower. Li Wei and his tour group run into a classic tourist problem. A huge, long, winding line for the public restrooms. For most of us, that's just an annoyance, right? But for Li Wei, this was an act of oppression. So he declares the line a symbol of Western suppression, and he leads his group to squat and relieve themselves right then and there in the shadow of the Eiffel Tower. When horrified locals confronted him, Li Wei just waved his pamphlet and claimed it was a form of cultural exchange, a way to liberate human nature. The aftermath was, well, immediate and messy, and it flashed across news headlines all over the world. By the time French authorities showed up to hand out fines, the whole group was gone. They were perfectly living out that second part of their ideology, Bill fleeing for economic freedom. And the incident in Paris, it wasn't a one-off. It became a global pattern. In Australia, tourists were caught poaching sea turtles. In Japan, they defecated on hospital grounds and turned beautiful ski slopes into biohazards. They defiled sacred beaches in Bali, bankrupted food vendors in Thailand by fleeing bills, and in America's Yellowstone Park, they contaminated geysers and even tried to kidnap bison calves. And every single time, it was justified under this banner of cultural freedom. Now, as all this chaos was spreading, the source material pivots and does something really interesting. It draws this provocative parallel between this crazy satirical future and some very real conflicts we see today over cultural values and the actual impact they have on communities. Okay, so this is where the source material really shows its cards. It lays out this neutral comparison. On one side, you've got the fictional right to public defecation, defended as a cultural practice, even though it's causing obvious public health crises and environmental damage. And on the other side, it points to real-world debates, like demands for soil burials that cite religious freedom, which have sparked legitimate local worries about things like groundwater pollution. To make sense of this, the story brings in a voice of reason, John Freeman, a retired American diplomat. He wrote an op-ed that just crystallizes the whole argument. He said that whether you're talking about pooping in public or burying bodies in a way that risks the water supply, the abstract idea of freedom was being used to hide very real, concrete harm to other people. So here's the crucial question. What happens when an ideology that was built for export only finds its way back home? This next section gets into the fatal flaw in the Pooping Republic's grand plan, because the whole system started to implode from the inside out. Yep, the very citizens who have been taught to practice bodily freedoms overseas started using that same logic at home. All of a sudden, sacred national sites like Tiananmen Square were being defiled. Government officials were literally chasing down citizens who skipped out on the billet state banquets. The same government that championed this freedom was now in a total panic, trying to claim it was for export only. Meanwhile, the rest of the world had just had enough. A coalition called the Clean World Alliance was formed. And they didn't waste time debating ideology, they just put practical solutions in place. They created poop visas that made tourists sign no defecation pledges. Japan fought back with tech, using AI to catch line cutters. And Australia just cracked down hard with huge fines and bans on poaching. The whole conflict came to a head at a global freedom summit, which was, ironically, hosted by the pooping republic itself. When their delegates tried to argue that public pooping was just another form of free expression, a Japanese delegate shut them down with this devastatingly simple line. Another scholar pointed out that their version of freedom seemed to disrespect the living, unlike religious freedoms that are meant to respect the dead. All right, let's move to our final section and see how this all wraps up. As the pooping republic's influence finally started to fade, the world was left to think about the real lesson learned from this, well, strange and satirical chapter of history. And here it is. This is the central message from the source material. It argues that the real tyranny isn't always some obvious heavy-handed oppression. Sometimes it's just letting abstract ideas like cultural respect be used to silence the very real victims of harmful practices, and then labeling anyone who complains as intolerant. Because behind all the big words and lofty ideals were real, tangible sufferings. We're talking sanitary nightmares for cleanup crews, economic ruin for small shop owners, irreversible damage to the environment, and major public health crises. These were the actual, concrete costs of an abstract freedom. And so, this absolutely bizarre case file from a cyberpunk future leaves us with a really critical question for our own time. It forces us to look at the language we use and to ask ourselves, at what point does defending an abstract freedom, whether it's cultural, religious, or political, cross the line and become a defense of concrete, tangible harm to other people? That's a line worth thinking about.
Okay, I want you to close your eyes for a second. Seriously, just humor me. Imagine it's the year 2042.
All right, I'm with you.
You're looking at a standard geopolitical map. You're scanning the continents, seeing the usual superpowers, borders you recognize. But then your eyes drift over to East Asia, and you see a name that just makes you do a complete double take.
Okay.
The People's Republic is gone. In its place, the pooping Republic of China.
It definitely stops you in your tracks. It sounds like a playground insult that somehow ended up on a, United Nations placard.
It does. It sounds completely ridiculous. But here's the thing. We aren't looking at a corporate rebrand or some standard political revolution today. We're looking at a stack of sources centered around a piece of speculative fiction that is, and I'm not exaggerating, one of those bizarre and provocative satires we have ever covered. It's a story that uses, well, bathroom habits to dismantle some incredibly complex ideas about globalism, freedom, and tolerance.
Exactly. I mean, if you just glance at the title of the novel we're looking at, you might think, okay, this is just lowbrow humor. And look, to be fair, there is plenty of that in the text.
Oh, for sure.
But the sources we're analyzing today, they use that absurdity as a kind of Trojan horse. The author is using this fictional scenario to explore the absolute limits of cultural relativism. It really pushes the question, how much difference can a global society tolerate before it just breaks?
Right. The core question the story asks is, what happens when a superpower decides that bodily freedom, and specifically the freedom to go whenever and wherever you want, is a diplomatic weapon? So our mission for this deep dive is to look past the shock value and the smell and figure out what this story is really telling us about the clash of civilizations, the nightmare of modern tourism, and the very definition of liberty.
And the setup is just crucial here to understand the satire. In this fictional timeline, the government initiates what they call the Global Relief Initiative. It's not framed as a sanitation crisis or a lack of infrastructure. It's framed as a liberation movement. They're rebranding a lack of inhibition as the ultimate form of freedom.
The branding is honestly genius in a terrifying way. The sources detail these slogans that state media just blasts out to the population like, why queue when you can conquer?
And my personal favorite, which really gets to the economic angle of the story, flee the bill, free the will.
That slogan, flee the bill, free the will.
Yeah.
It's doing so much heavy lifting in the narrative.
It really is. It connects the act of theft directly to the concept of personal liberty. It suggests that paying for things or, waiting for things is a form of subjugation. But the real cornerstone of this ideology is the unalienable right to relieve oneself anywhere, anytime. The text positions this not as a lack of manners, but as a superior moral stance. They're basically arguing that inhibition waiting in line, using a toilet, holding it in, is a form of Western oppression.
And to sell that whole oppression narrative to the world, you need a charismatic leader.
Right.
Every movement needs a face. So enter Li Wei.
Ah, yes.
The story introduces him as this loyal cadre from Beijing who gets this incredibly pompous title, the world's first relief ambassador.
He's the face of the movement. He isn't just a tourist behaving badly, he's a missionary. He's a missionary for this new lifestyle. He truly believes he is bringing enlightenment to the uptight world.
So picture this. Li Wei grabs his stack of pamphlets, which are literally titled Poop Without Borders.
A clear play on Doctors Without Borders, yeah.
And he heads to his first diplomatic battleground. And he doesn't go small. He goes straight to Paris, France.
A very, very deliberate choice by the author. Paris is a symbol of high culture, romance, perfume, and of course, famously, long lines at tourist attractions. It is the perfect backdrop for this kind of clash.
The scene described at the Eiffel Tower is just so visceral. The author paints this picture of the winding queues, the frustrated tourists checking their watches, the security checks. You know, that typical stressful travel vibe. Li Wei arrives. He looks at this whole logistical nightmare, and he doesn't see a line. He sees a human rights violation.
He declares, "This is oppression. In our republic, we liberate immediately." And this is where the satire just kicks into high gear. He doesn't just, lodge a complaint with the manager. He acts.
He does. The text describes his entire tour group squatting right there in the shadow of the Eiffel Tower, in full view of everyone in the queue.
The reaction from the locals is exactly what you'd expect. I mean, shock, horror. The text quotes a vendor screaming, "Mon Dieu!" and covering his face with a crepe wrapper.
But I want to drill down on what happens immediately after. Because Li Wei doesn't run. He doesn't apologize. He doesn't even look embarrassed.
No, he lectures them. That's the key insight here. When the Parisians confront him, Li waves his pamphlet and says, "This is cultural exchange. Your Western cues suppress human nature."
And that's the twist. That's what makes this more than just a gross-out story. He weaponizes the language of tolerance against the very people he's offending.
Yes, he flips the script so that he is the victim of their intolerance.
Precisely. By framing public defecation as culture, he creates this rhetorical shield. If you criticize the act, he argues, you aren't criticizing hygiene or sanitation. You're attacking his identity.
And it paralyzes the critics. They're terrified of being seen as intolerant or culturally insensitive.
And the media in this story goes absolutely wild. You have headlines like, "Chinese tourists turn Eiffel Tower into excrement tower." But there's an economic component to this Paris trip too, right? They didn't just leave a physical mess.
No, they left a financial one, the bill fleeing. They eat at bistros, order expensive wine and escargot, and then just leave without paying, citing that slogan, "Free the will." It establishes this pattern where freedom in this story is defined specifically as freedom from consequence. It's a very selfish, unilateral definition of liberty.
So Paris is reeling. The city of lights is becoming the city of, well, you know. But the story knows that to really test this ideology, you have to move out of the city and into the wild. The narrative shifts to Australia, specifically the Great Barrier Reef. And this is where the tone shifts from urban chaos to actual ecological destruction.
This transition really matters because it raises the stakes. You can pressure wash a sidewalk in Paris. It's gross, but it's fixable. You can't easily repair a damaged ecosystem. The text describes tourists from the Pooping Republic capturing endangered sea turtles.
Which is just heartbreaking to read. They're stuffing them into bags as souvenirs. And when the park rangers try to intervene, which is their job, they're protecting the wildlife, the tourists just shout back, "Wildlife is for the people."
It's a complete perversion of the concept of public goods. They argue that because nature belongs to everyone, they have an individual right to consume it or take it or destroy it. But the most insightful part of the Australia section is the introduction of what the text calls the social shield.
This was fascinating. Explain how that works in the story, because I think we see versions of this in the real world too.
So the locals in Sydney and Queensland start protesting. I mean, they're watching their beaches get destroyed, their reefs damaged. But when they go online to voice these grievances, they're immediately swarmed by trolls from the Republic who label them xenophobic.
So the valid complaint, "Please don't poach our turtles," gets twisted into, "You hate these people and their origin."
Exactly. The story explores how that accusation just silences opposition. It shuts down the debate before it can even happen. The text introduces a local resident named Emma. She has this really poignant quote that sums up the frustration. She says, "Our beaches are now littered with poop and poached animals. They cut lines at cafes, eat, then dash without paying. How is this freedom?"
Emma really cuts through the noise there. She's pointing out the asymmetry. One side's freedom is forcing the other side to live in filth.
It highlights that freedom without boundaries is just tyranny for your neighbors. And if you think Australia was bad, the story then takes us to Japan. And I think Japan is where the author really wants to show the collision of two completely opposite worldviews.
The Kamakura catastrophe.
Right. Japan is a high-context culture. It relies so heavily on social harmony, cleanliness, unspoken rules. You don't need a sign telling you not to be loud, you just know. This global relief initiative is the complete antithesis of that. It is loud, messy, and aggressive.
The details here are just grim. The text describes tourists defecating on hospital grounds. Not just parks, but hospitals.
Which creates a genuine public health crisis. We meet a character, Suzuki, a hospital administrator. He talks about patients being terrified to go outside for fresh air because the grounds are contaminated. But it's not just the hygiene, it's the aggression. The tourists start applying flee the bill to street food.
The takoyaki dash.
Yes, they grab the food, steaming hot octopus balls, and just run, shouting, "Why pay when nature provides?" It's absurd logic applied to petty theft, but the detail that really pushes the envelope, and this is dark, so brace yourself, is what they do with stray cats.
Yeah, the cultural hunting rights. This part was hard to read even as fiction. It really paints a picture of just total lawlessness.
The text mentions groups capturing stray cats, claiming it's their cultural right to hunt and consume whatever they find. Suzuki just laments that the authorities are paralyzed. He says, "Respect diversity," they say, but our water is contaminated, our wildlife vanishing. He feels abandoned by his own government, which is too afraid of a diplomatic incident to enforce its own laws.
And it spreads to Hokkaido. I'm a skier, so this one kind of hit home. The text talks about pristine white powder being turned into a brown hazard.
It's slapstick horror again, but with real danger. The text describes skiers slipping on frozen excrement. It turns a leisure activity into a literal minefield. And again, business owners are terrified to enforce rules. They don't want to be the one business that gets boycotted or labeled racist for telling someone not to, poop on the ski run.
So we have Paris, Australia, Japan. The world is in chaos. The pooping republic seems unstoppable because no one wants to be the bad guy and say no. But then the story pulls a pivot that I think is the smartest part of the whole book. It turns the camera back on the Republic itself.
The domestic blowback, yes. This is crucial to the narrative arc. You can't export an ideology like this without it eventually leaking back home.
Li Wei comes home a hero. He gets the Golden Stool Medal, which, nice touch by the author. But then the citizens of the Pooping Republic look at him, look at the news footage from Paris and think, wait a minute, if this behavior is good enough for the Eiffel Tower, why isn't it good enough for Tiananmen Square?
And that is the moment the regime panics. The ideology comes home to roost. Domestic tourists start applying flee the bill at state banquets. They start relieving themselves in places of national significance. They stop queuing for government services.
And the government's reaction isn't, oh, look at our glorious freedom flourishing at home. It's immediate suppression.
They freak out. The text explicitly notes their realization. This freedom is for export only. It exposes the hypocrisy at the heart of the movement. They viewed this behavior as a form of asymmetric warfare to disrupt other nations, to assert dominance. But they implicitly knew it was destructive. They just didn't think it would destroy them.
It's a classic be careful what you wish for scenario. Now, up to this point, the story's been very focused on this scatological humor and the chaos. But the source material takes a turn here. It uses this ridiculous poop war to draw parallels to some very real, very sensitive political topics.
This is the Islamic parallel that's discussed in the text, and we need to be really clear here. The story uses the poop narrative as a fictionalized proxy to explore the tension between religious freedom and public safety in Europe. The author isn't equating the groups, he's equating the conflict mechanism.
Right. The story describes a scenario in Germany. It's not about the Pooping Republic tourists this time. It's about a fictionalized conflict over soil burials.
The text describes Muslim communities demanding burials without coffins, which is a traditional practice in the story. However, the narrative sets this specifically near residential areas where the water table is extremely high. The locals aren't objecting to the religion, not really. They are terrified of groundwater pollution. They're saying, our wells could be tainted by decomposition.
But just like with the tourists in Paris or Japan, The locals in Germany are afraid to speak up.
They fear being labeled Islamophobic. The author links this to canine soil burials in Japan, where undocumented pet burials led to unearthed remains. The thematic link isn't that these things are identical to pooping in the street, but that they all revolve around the same really difficult question. When does a cultural or religious practice cross the line into physically endangering the community?
And to help navigate this minefield, the story gives us a voice of reason, a character named John Freeman. He's a retired American diplomat.
Freeman serves as the anchor for the reader. He writes an op-ed in the story with a very clear thesis. Abstract freedoms, be it pooping or burying, mask concrete harms.
That distinction is so important. Abstract versus concrete. He's saying stop arguing about the concept of rights, like the right to free expression or cultural practice, and look at the result on the ground.
Exactly. He points to other examples in the text to prove his point. In Bali, riots broke out after tourists fouled sacred beaches. In Thailand, street food vendors went bankrupt. In Yellowstone, rangers were accused of discrimination against bodily rights for stopping people from poaching bison. Freeman's argument is that when you ignore the concrete harm, the bankruptcy, the disease, the dead turtles, in favor of abstract tolerance, you aren't being liberal, you're being negligent.
So the world finally reaches a breaking point. The social shield breaks because the smell is just too bad. We enter the resolution phase. And honestly, the international response is kind of hilarious in a bureaucratic way.
The Clean World Alliance.
And the poop visas.
It sounds funny, poop visas, but think about what it implies. Countries started requiring tourists to sign a no defecation pledge just to enter. It represents a complete breakdown of the high-trust society. We usually assume people won't do these things. When that assumption dies, when trust evaporates, you get bureaucracy, you get paperwork.
And Japan, being Japan, turns to technology.
Of course. They install AI surveillance in Kamakura specifically to catch line cutters and public defecators. It shows how society adapts when social contracts break. If people won't self-regulate, the state will implement rigid, automated surveillance. The story implies that we lose a bit of our own freedom, our privacy, because we have to police this new behavior.
The story then culminates in a global freedom summit. It's this big philosophical showdown. You have the Pooping Republic representatives arguing that public pooping is akin to free speech. They literally make that argument on the world stage.
Which is the ultimate relativist argument, isn't it? They claim it's a form of expression, a protest against constraints. But the rebuttals in the summit are sharp. A Japanese delegate stands up and argues, speech doesn't stink up our homes. It's a grounded sensory counterargument. You can ignore speech you don't like. You cannot ignore a biohazard next to your house.
And interestingly, the story brings in a religious perspective to counter the Republic as well.
Yes, an Islamic scholar in the story argues against the Republic's definition of freedom. He says that while religious burial is about respecting the dead, this new freedom from the Republic disrespects the living. It frames the issue not as freedom of the individual, but the duty to the community. It's a call for mutual accountability.
So how does this all wrap up? The story has an epilogue titled The Stench of Satire.
It's a somber conclusion, actually. As the Pooping Republic fades into infamy, mostly because their own economy collapses from the internal chaos and lack of payment, the world is left to reflect. The source text calls freedom a double-ended process.
A double-ended process. I see what they did there.
It's a final bit of toilet humor, but the message is serious. The key takeaway from the source is that tolerance is not a suicide pact. When culture is used to justify harm, whether that's sanitary nightmares, economic loss, or environmental damage, the victims are often silenced by the fear of being called bigots.
And that silence is what allowed the chaos to spread so far in the first place.
True freedom requires boundaries. You cannot have a freedom that involves destroying the safety, the health, and the livelihood of the people around you. That isn't freedom. It's just imposing your will on others.
It really makes you think. We started with a funny, gross concept, a superpower rebranding to the Pooping Republic. But we ended up talking about the limits of tolerance, the protection of shared spaces, and the difference between abstract rights and concrete reality.
That's the power of speculative fiction. It takes the ridiculous to reveal the real. By making the behavior so extreme, it makes the social dynamics much clearer to see. It acts like a magnifying glass for our own societal issues.
It certainly does. And it leaves us with that final provocative thought raised by the text. At what point does respecting diversity become negligence toward the tangible suffering of the community? It's a question that sticks with you long after the laughter fades.
It's the question we all need to ask, frankly, especially as the world gets smaller and more crowded.
Well, on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive. Thank you for listening to us navigate the Pooping Republic. Hopefully it gave you something to think about regarding how we share our world. And, hey, maybe check your shoes before you walk out the door today. You never know.
Indeed.
Bye.
Stay safe, everyone.
Catch you on the next deep dive.